critical of everything, it's fine.
That's very admirable. And it's great to be starting on such an admirable note.
Yes, I
So
see we are streaming live on YouTube.
we are. And right before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the Stanford campus is located within the traditional territory of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, and that this land was never ceded. Well, all right, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Khushmita Thabai. I am the Center for South Asia and Markards Fellow for 2023 to 2024. And welcome to our session today on Neighbors in Flux, explaining India's diplomacy amid regional challenges. So, amid significant domestic political upheavals within its neighboring nations, India has navigated a complex landscape to safeguard its economic and security interests. Recent events have highlighted the intricacies faced by the region. I mean, you've had Bangladesh's electoral processes marred by political violence. You've had Myanmar grappling with civil unrest following the 2021 military coup. And then, of course, Pakistan contending with multiple crises encompassing political instability, economic hurdles, and escalating violence. Moreover, the looming influence of China, coupled with an ongoing border dispute, further amplifies the intricacies of the region's geopolitical dynamics. Now, within this context, it's interesting to delve into India's neighborhood first policy, a pivotal tenet of Prime Minister Modi's leadership. And with a general election just months away, this is quite a moment for retrospection and a chance for all of us India and South Asia watchers to reflect on what has changed over the past decade of Prime Minister Modi's government and how specifically has the neighborhood first policy evolved. And few individuals have observed this space as closely as Dr. Pandey, who is joining us today. Dr. Aparna Pandey is a research fellow at the Hudson Institute, specializing in South Asia with a focus in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, specifically through the lens of foreign policy and security. Dr. Pandey has contributed to numerous publications, including the Hindustan Times, Times of India, Live Mint, Huffington Post, and the list keeps on going on and on. Dr. Pandey, we are incredibly honored to have you with us today.
Good afternoon. I think it must be noon now on the Pacific coast as well. So good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks a lot, Kushmita, for the really nice introduction. I'll sort of try and keep my remarks to 15-20 minutes so that there's more of a conversation. 2022 and 2023 were years of global engagement for India. 2024 is turning out in many ways to be the year when India focuses more on its immediate neighborhood or South Asia. For all its desire to be a global power, India's priorities have always been ensuring primacy in South Asia. There are 5 countries in South Asia, including India, which would have held elections before the US presidential election in November of this year. Maldives, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and Sri Lanka will all have had elections by then. And all these elections will impact India's relationship with the states India sees as part of its historical neighborhood. India and Indians, by and large, take pride in the fact that we are a 5,000-year-old civilization. And India's foreign policy has been shaped by the idea of India's geostrategic and civilizational preeminence, especially in what India refers to as the Indian subcontinent or South Asia. Even after partition, after 200 years of colonial rule, the makers of modern India's foreign policy saw the Indian subcontinent as one entity and sought close ties with countries that were part of civilizational India. And from India's point of view, these countries are important because they are key to India's territorial integrity and security. As a post-colonial country that was partitioned at independence, territorial integrity is key to India's security. For every Indian government, for the last 77 years almost, security means ensuring that the Indian subcontinent remains stable, it remains peaceful. India's immediate neighbors are its first line of security. So they are not just an integral part of Indian civilization, they are important for India's security interests. And India's security interests depend on India's neighbors being stable, keeping India's interests in mind, and not allowing their territories to be used either as safe havens or by powers that are antagonistic to India. India is the geographical, socio-cultural, and economic center of South Asia. Some of India's neighboring states were part of an Indian empire. Others emerged as separate kingdoms within the Indian civilization. India is also the only country in South Asia that shares land or sea borders with all the other South Asian countries that form part of SAARC, or the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation, with the exception of Afghanistan. Border disagreements and India's size have often fueled resentment or fear of domination among India's neighbors. The 1947 partition of India left a legacy, and to some extent, to a large extent, it defined India's relationship with Pakistan, which has, since its inception, defined its national identity and its foreign policy in opposition to what it refers to as quote unquote Hindu India. But in all of India's neighbors, all of India's neighbors, local leaders, politicians, and elite have often complained about India's domination and resisted acknowledging India as the region's big brother. And, to a large extent, leaving aside certain nuances, India's leaders have been quite consistent in prioritizing relations with their neighbors. India has never sought to annex a neighbor's territory. India has never sought to deprive them of their sovereignty. And although India has never pursued a hegemonistic agenda, that has rarely assuaged the concerns of India's neighbors. Notwithstanding at some level in the liberal internationalist tone of India at global fora, the Indian state is very deeply anchored in realism, especially when it comes to India's relations with its immediate neighbors. India inherited borders it did not like at independence, but unlike other countries, especially India's large neighbor to the north, India does not try to change borders by force. India has accepted the territorial status quo with some friction, which involves wars with Pakistan. But in many cases, India has tried to resolve the border dispute. With Bangladesh, it took decades. I think the border agreement conversation started in 1974. The two countries finally signed that agreement in 2015. Others like Nepal, the differences continue. And in Nepal issued a new map in 2020, laying claims to extra territory of in northern India. Now, these territorial claims, often interfere with what India has referred to or its desire for a kind of an entente cordiale with all its neighbors. It's not been as easy to achieve that. You can call it sins of omission and commission. There are things India could have done. There are things India maybe should not have done. But when you are the largest country in a region and you are so overwhelmingly bigger than your neighbors, it is very difficult. It's like what they say, it's damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, because you have sometimes there are things you can't help doing or help getting blamed for. India has a long-standing policy of avoiding military alliances. India has never been part of a military treaty globally. India only deploys its military overseas under UN mandated missions, peacekeeping primarily. But India has had a long history of military engagement with its South Asian neighbors. And it's not just the wars with Pakistan that I'm talking about. In the 1950s, India supported and protected the King of Nepal, the creation of Bangladesh. Let's go down to the south in Sri Lanka, the Indian peacekeeping mission in Sri Lanka, the Indian commandos who prevented the coup in Maldives, India's military training for Nepal's military and intelligence, for Bhutan's military, and for military of Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, most of the other countries. And when Afghanistan was a republic for 2 decades, India did train Afghan military and intelligence and civilian officers. However, there has been a lot of pushback from India's neighbors with respect to how they view India. And the India factor has become, even if to a large extent, India's neighbors are not necessarily a factor in India's general elections. They are sometimes in state elections. The Tamil factor will play in Tamil Nadu's elections. You'll have, sort of Bangladesh will play in West Bengal and elections in the Northeast. Pakistan does sometimes periodically play a role, and Nepal will play a role, or the Madhesi issue will play a role in UP and Bihar elections. But India is a factor in the elections of most of the countries. The India factor plays out most recently in the Maldives elections in October. So this time there's a government in power which believes India should be kept out of Maldives. Sri Lanka has had parties which have either had a better relationship with India, which is currently with the current president, Vikram Singhe, but they've also had political party which have wanted to push India out. Same thing in Bangladesh and Nepal. In Pakistan, it has gone back and forth. There have been, for a long time, India used to be a big factor in Pakistan's elections, at least till the 2018 elections that used to happen. The recent 2024 elections, India wasn't a factor. It was more Pakistan's own domestic politics, but India wasn't even mentioned by any political party. In Bangladesh, however, India did play a role. The Awami League is closer to India. The Bangladesh National Party, BNP, and the Jamaat-e-Islami have often attacked the Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina Wajid, and Awami League for being very pro-India. The same thing in Sri Lanka and Nepal. Now, the challenge India faces, for example, if we just take the example of the Maldives election, is it poses a challenge for India's security interests and for the neighborhood first policy. In many ways, the neighborhood first policy isn't new. Right from 1947, India has prioritized South Asia. If you pick up the speech by any Indian president going back 77 years, at the start of the Lok Sabha session, every year the president delivers his or her remarks. And first few paragraphs will always talk about South Asia and India's relation with its neighborhood. And then India progresses outwards. It will talk about other countries. So South Asia matters to India. It is critical. And it has become more critical in the last 3 decades because of the rise of China. During the Cold War, even if the United States was supporting Pakistan, neither US nor the Soviet Union craved Indian territory and neither of them wanted to reduce Indian influence in South Asia. Both the United States and Soviet Union actually wanted better relations with India. And neither of them challenged Indian, let's say, primacy in the subcontinent. Today, however, the challenge India faces is that it has a neighbor to the north, which sits on Indian territory, about 40,000 square miles in Aksai chain, and craves a lot more of Indian territory all along the Indian border. Also lays claim to Nepalese territory, the entire state of Sikkim, the entire state of Arunachal Pradesh, and parts of Bhutanese territory. And China is the largest trading partner of every country of South Asia, including India. All other countries of South Asia, except for India, are a part of BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative. Pakistan may have taken the largest loans under BRI, but number 2 is Bangladesh, and then Sri Lanka and Maldives. So all of India's neighbors owe massive debts to China. Now, it has taken India a number of decades to realize that, having a sphere of influence isn't simply telling the other country that, you are part of my sphere of influence. It is being able to expend resources in order to ensure that that country that you are denying any space to a competitor. And India has ceded space, till about a decade or so ago to China in South Asia. And so India is playing catch up. But India doesn't have the dollars to throw. India does, however, have certain advantages. One, India has never viewed international relations from the point of view of whether or not that country is a democracy or an autocracy. As I said, it's a very realist foreign policy. Would India prefer country to be democracy? Absolutely. Is India going to try and change that country into a democracy? No. So India has dealt with its neighbors irrespective of whether they are monarchies, communist countries, capitalist countries or military dictatorships. India has also been willing to deploy all, as you can call sort of, we can go into Chanakyan realpolitik, India's equivalent of Machiavelli, and say any possible way, whether it is offering economic assistance, developmental assistance, military assistance, or support at IMF, World Bank. For example, when Sri Lanka had its crisis in last April, um, a lot of it was because of what it owed China, the massive debts which came. And Sri Lanka did not have money. The first country to offer Sri Lanka aid, about $4 billion worth of fuel, food, support at the IMF and World Bank was India. The Indian finance minister tried to persuade IMF to give Sri Lanka a bailout loan. And so India did the same thing for Maldives. And it helps Bangladesh, it helps all its neighbors. And so that's the first thing, which is India, if as long as the neighbor is willing to keep India's security interest in mind, India would be willing to offer economic, developmental assistance and other military or technical assistance. Second, in the decades after independence, India did not really have and sort of money. India wasn't growing economically. Today, India is the third fastest growing emerging economy. India has money to give and it sort of give its neighbors. And so India can offer economic assistance, technical assistance, even military hardware to its smaller neighbors. India has also found ways to bolster regional trade, connectivity, investment. All of these, you're keeping India's interest in mind, there will be more which will come your way. India has also been willing to defend these countries and support them in international fora if these countries keep India's interest in mind. For example, Bangladesh. A lot of criticism of the Bangladesh regime, but India has supported the regime. India is willing to give non-tariff barriers, reduce them, lower tariff, non-tariff barriers, lines of credit to build infrastructure, build regional electricity grids, which would help Bangladesh and even broader into Myanmar and Southeast Asia. Debt relief programs. India also views itself as a first responder for any humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. This goes back about 2 decades to the 2004 Asian tsunami. So when COVID hit, India provided medical supplies, medical teams. The Indian Navy has helped not just in the tsunami, but the Somali pirates attacks for the last 2 decades, the more recent Houthi attacks in the Arabian Sea and Persian Gulf. The Indian Navy has been stopping, is out there. India also gives a lot of developmental assistance directly, bilaterally, also gives it via World Bank, IMF, and other agencies. India has also used its trade and tourism in its neighborhood, to build, to send the message that it's not just Chinese tourists or Russian tourists, but Indian trade and tourism, which can help the countries. A lot of, infrastructure building, rehabilitation, like in Sri Lanka, India is supporting and building a lot of the rehabilitation, reconstruction in the Tamil areas, which were destroyed during the Civil War. In Maldives, it has done a lot. So right now, one will have to see what happens. So I think at some level, the Maldives government, after the rhetoric, will actually back off because it does need India's support. And you can't escape geography. You are where you are. You cannot relocate yourself somewhere else. Mexico and Canada cannot relocate, and neither can Maldives, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, or Pakistan. They are stuck with India, and India has, so they will have to deal with India whether or not they like it. India, the first few months of this year, the India's top diplomats have traveled to Bhutan, Nepal. There are, conversations with Maldives, with Sri Lanka. India knows what's happening. And so India is trying to ensure that it it is, it provides what is required on the developmental, economic, technical side. It knows that countries will always try and hedge, but India's sort of basic underlying sort of, policy guidance to all its neighbors has been, you cannot escape us, we cannot escape you, we will be there. And remember, at the end of the day, when you are in a when you are in a big problem, it is India which will come and help you. For example, China does not help any country at the IMF or World Bank. Whether it's Pakistan, whether it's Sri Lanka or Maldives, China does not give economic assistance. It does not give developmental assistance. And so if those countries need it, then they will have to either go to a country like the United States and the Western countries or Japan, or then their immediate neighbor, India. I will stop here, and then I'm happy to, sort of answer any questions that people may have.
Thank you so much for your comments, Dr. Pandey. So in terms of, I have a lot of questions myself, but in terms of how I'd like to structure the Q&A segment, so as part of the fellowship, one of my responsibilities was reaching out to South Asia watchers on campus. And so I've collated a list of questions everyone sent to me. And then obviously there are a couple of questions I've had myself from your wonderful comments.
Sure.
And so if we can begin with something you mentioned about the neighborhood first policy being an aspect that successive governments of India have prioritized. And so there have been various iterations of this in the past, right? You've had Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's more muscular and defense-oriented approach. You've had Prime Minister Gujral's more big brother-esque approach as well. So the historical background is rich and varied. Against this backdrop, how does Prime Minister Modi's neighborhood first policy distinguish itself from these previous iterations, according to you?
So I'd say there's, India's foreign policy has a lot more of continuity than change. So I'd say it has elements of, of both, of all the policies. And so let's just start off with, because sort of before Indira Gandhi, Nehru's policy towards South Asia was basically that, we know what is best for you. And sort of since we are focused more on the global stage, we will keep an eye out for what's happening in the region. But India wasn't really that concerned about what's happening in South Asia. But the notion was Delhi knows best, and that Delhi knows best stays to this day. India does believe that India knows what is best for its neighbors, but that's natural for any country which is the heart, and which is for lack of another word, the hegemon in the region. It is India's backyard or front yard, however you call it, South Asia in the Indian Ocean region. Indira Gandhi had a more muscular shade. She had her version of what people call the Indira doctrine, which was that, if any external power comes into the region, be it South, United States, be it Soviet Union, be it China, that country needs to recognize India as the hegemon, and only then would India accept that country in the region. Didn't really happen. United States supported Pakistan with the 71 war and all of that. But the notion remained that India is the heart of South Asia, that any country, any foreign country external to South Asia which comes in must recognize India as the hegemon. And sort of, countries which do not do so, and that India's neighbors must keep India's interests in mind. We saw that with respect to whether it was Pakistan, the creation of Bangladesh. We saw it with Sikkim. We saw it with respect to Sri Lanka. When we come to the Gujral doctrine, it was an attempt in the, sort of to try and say that, so India is big enough, and India is willing to take a hit at some level. Let's say India opens up, sort of lowers its tariff and non-tariff barriers. We are willing to allow our neighbors to do well economically and trade with us and maybe benefit from it, if the countries are willing to sort of promise that they will not allow their territory to be used. If you recall, the Gujarat doctrine had an explicit line that territory will not be used against the interests of the other country. Some level, some punch shield doctrine thrown in it. But another level, it is a reiteration of the Indira doctrine, which is that do not use territory sort of in any sort of you should not allow your territory to be used for interests that are antithetical to India.
Mhm.
That remains in the neighborhood first policy. The neighborhood first policy is that the neighborhood is, is first and foremost for India. It has been for 77 years.
Mhm.
The neighborhood first means that India will do what it can to its neighbors, those neighbors who keep India's interests in mind. India will ignore what kind of regime it is, as long as the regime keeps India's interests in mind. India will offer, if the regime keeps India's interests in mind, India will offer developmental aid, economic assistance, investment, support at international fora and regional fora.
Mhm.
If the regime does not keep India's interests in mind, India will not offer these things. But India will send the message that, remember, at the end of the day, you will need to come back to us,
Mhm.
because the other country you are looking to for support will not support you. And the Sri Lanka example showed it. I mean, Maldives will go through what Maldives does, but it may then end up coming back. Was you in 2019, when the last Maldives elections were held, those elections were held, and the sort of the government which came into power came in and realized that they owed massive amounts of money to China. And so in 2019, 2020, it was India, United States, Japan, with the international financial institutions helping Maldives do better on their loans and debt sustainability and financing. And so, it is unfortunate that these countries are going through this cycle, but at sort of, at a basic level, the neighborhood first policy continues the primacy that South Asia or the Indian subcontinent holds in India's foreign policy, and that will not change anytime in the coming decades.
Mhm. Right. So you make a very interesting point about China that I'll return to in a while. But something that I do want your opinion on is there's a concern that's been voiced by a lot of scholars and commentators, Constantino Xavier being one of them, and they all claim that while previous governments have all promised to prioritize India's neighborhood and address the credibility gap India has over there, this fervor sort of fizzles out over the tenure. So I'm curious about one, what you think about this characterization, and two, whether Prime Minister Modi's neighborhood first policy challenges or conforms to this notion that initial high interest is there in amongst all governments with regards to the neighborhood first policy, and then it's followed by a decline in priority in favor of other foreign policy agendas.
So I'd say sort of, I'll make 2 points here. One, every government which comes in anywhere in the world
Mhm.
will always in the first 6 months to 1 year announce a number of projects and programs, right? It's natural. You're coming in, there's certain promises you made in election campaigns. There are certain things you want to show that you are different from the person or persons before you. Even whether it is, calling it by a different name, whether it is, sort of prioritizing it,
Mhm.
is natural for any government anywhere in the world. So, it's like I would say that every Indian civilian, every Indian prime minister comes in saying they will resolve the Kashmir dispute and the relationship with Pakistan. Every one of them, even Prime Minister Modi in 2014 when he came, every Indian prime minister has promised that. And in the last 2-3 decades, the every civilian Pakistani prime minister has also promised that. Hasn't happened, right? But you come in saying you will do it because it is important that any prime minister or any president has to come in and announce that they are going to do these things which they know public opinion will want them to do, or their electoral manifestos. So yes, it's natural that the first 6 months or 1 year there's a lot of push. Second, I would sort of caution. I would say that at some level geopolitics interferes. It is very, sort of, it is easy to come in saying, I'm going to look at something, and then something happens. I mean, there are people who will say that they said 2 years ago that Russia will invade Ukraine, but most people did not believe that it will actually happen. Or forget about that, the Middle East, Gaza is Israel conflict. Could people have said even 2 weeks before that that Hamas will launch that attack. No, right? They may have thought that it will do it someday, but they didn't really think that that's going to happen because Israel has a really good intelligence and apparatus and all of that. So geopolitics happens. And when geopolitics happens, whether it is something happening in the Indian Ocean, the Houthi attacks, which now mean that all our shipping has to go via Cape of Good Hope, right? Whether it is the Ukraine conflict, which meant that India would have had to evacuate people, sort of purchase, sort of Russian oil because it is cheaper. Whether it's the Middle East crisis, which means that, the IMEC, which was being planned after G20, the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, hasn't really worked out as quickly as people thought it would, right? So there are all these things which happen. So I would say that, yes, there's hype at the start. Second, it is true that geopolitics, with the global or regional, mean that countries cannot always focus on what they have sort of started off by hyping, but they may have to focus on the run-of-the-mill foreign policy and diplomacy, which you have to do and which is important. Third, sort of, it is easy to say that we are going to change things. But India's biggest problem for the last, 77 years, when it's wanted to do more in its neighborhood, whether it's South Asia or even if you go beyond into Africa, where India has a lot of development presence, is basically resources. The Indian economy never grew in the 50s, 60s, 70s. 70s and 80s, we grew really abysmally slow. Only from the 1990s that India's economy has grown. It's only in the last 2 decades that India actually has that extra money to give. Most of the projects that India is investing in are infrastructure projects. They take a long time. And since most of India's developmental assistance goes through public sector enterprises, it will take a lot of time to actually, follow through. I would use the example of Afghanistan, where, India gave $3 billion, the largest bilateral regional donor. It built a dam, it built a highway. Unfortunately, what happened in the country, there's nothing India can do about. But India does deliver. It's just that, one, it is tough to do so in a neighborhood where, it's not Europe post World War II, where you could build a lot and you didn't have pushback. And you didn't have to fight somebody else in Western Europe. Eastern, yes, but not in Western Europe. So the roads could be built, infrastructure could be built. South Asia, there's always some conflict, some insurgency going on. It is difficult to get resources for building projects which take time. And the Indian sort of, let's say, Indian public sector enterprises haven't really built things as quickly as the Japanese or the Chinese have.
Right, that's interesting. I'm also curious about how you place the Ministry of External Affairs into this, because for the longest time, our Ministry of External Affairs hasn't had the greatest budgetary allocations or personnel allocations. So, do you think the fact that this has been growing with the Modi government might indicate, one, a prioritizing of expanding India's reach within its neighborhood, and two, also the fact that now we have bodies like the National Security Council, like individual ministries as well, dealing with issues beyond borders, which earlier was just a matter of the MEA. So is that something you look at positively in terms of India's engagement?
So yes, but I would say no. I mean, I'd say yes and no both. Sort of India is doing a lot more. Unfortunately, India took a very long time, and sort of, there are many reasons for it, for not expanding its foreign service. And so the expansion of the foreign service basically started in the late 2000s. And so India has one of the smallest foreign service. India hates being told that, and Indian diplomats will fight with you about it. But India has one of the smallest foreign services. Israel has a larger foreign service. Singapore has more diplomats. Obviously, China has 6 times Indian diplomats, and Brazil has 3 times India's diplomats. So yes, I mean, India has more diplomats today than they did about a decade ago, but India needs a lot more. Second, yes, the MEA is doing a lot, but I'm one of those who believes that, there are areas for the MEA, but then there are areas for other ministries. At the end of the day, Foreign policy and diplomacy, yes, for the MEA. But I believe that when it is something to do with defense or security, it should be the Ministry of Defense, and the military uniformed services should be involved in it. It's something to do with commerce or finance or space or science and technology. Those ministries should be involved in it. It is growing, but it's still not a sort of, the Indian system is still not geared, to have the line ministries, as they are called, to play that kind of a role. It is geared more for the MEA to play the role and then draw in a few people from here and there. And that takes time. The more interactions take place, the more likely the line ministries will end up being involved, and that is good. Resources is, yes, because it's sort of, um, in sort of, there are more resources. India actually has been giving developmental assistance going back decades.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that it used to be much smaller in amount. India has a larger budget, GDP is bigger, and so the developmental assistance has grown. The problem with India's developmental assistance isn't necessarily the amount. It is more been the, sort of, if I promise Kushmita that in 1 week you will have something,
Mm-hmm.
you will understand if I'm a few days late. But I think there will be a problem if every time I say 1 week and it comes in 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
So sort of, there has to be a better way of delivering on promises. And while India's deliverance on promises has improved, there is a lot more that the Indian system has to do to ensure that if, and especially because on the opposite side is China, which has not only more money to throw, but a much bigger paraphernalia to set up things, to build the same infrastructure projects and, sort of do them faster, make them shinier,
Mm-hmm.
even if that means a debt, whereas the Indian project will not really end up lead to debt from that country. So sort of, India's advantage is that India, sort of, the infrastructure will be built at, with a very low interest loan or a grant. It will be local labor, not Indian labor,
Mm-hmm.
unlike on the Chinese side. And so the country isn't going into debt. But it takes much longer. It's not as shinier, and the elite don't get kickbacks.
Yeah.
So India is fighting all of these. And so you have to do a better job,
Mm-hmm.
even if you have less resources. There's a lot India can do. And so that's where the developmental assistance normally faces a challenge. India is doing better today than it did a decade ago, but it'll always sort of, when you're playing catch up and when your system isn't geared to this, it does take longer to deliver.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I'd assume that's where looping in India's private sector can be specifically helpful because we have had a private sector that has performed
Yes.
increasingly well domestically with infrastructural projects.
Yeah.
Exporting it would also be quite beneficial.
It has actually. For example, sort of just an example of geopolitics, the Haifa port in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
The Chinese company had, I believe, has a lease on a terminal there, but the Haifa port is being privatized and rebuilt with an Indian and an Israeli company.
Mm-hmm. That's a fascinating dynamic to note. I also want to pick up on something you mentioned about China, that China is this strategic competitor for India within its neighborhood. And that sort of makes me think, and we receive a lot of questions around this. How much of India's engagement within its neighborhood has been driven by concerns about China rather than recognizing the intrinsic benefits within the region? Um, is there a rationale, at least from the way Prime Minister Modi is seeing it right now, for engaging in the neighborhood beyond the Chinese threat? Because I know you mentioned the internal state politics factor as well, right? That West Bengal elections will definitely feature discussions about relations with Bangladesh. But I'm curious as to, does India, especially under the current leadership, emphasize China more than the intrinsic benefits of the region as a whole?
So I'd say no. I mean, I'd say for India, it's part of the same dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
For India, its neighbors are its first layer of security. They were its first layer of security even when it was Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai in the 1950s. They are its first layer of security when Cold War ended. and they remain its first layer of security. They'll always be its first layer of security. The Indian state is a modern Indian state, post-partition and independence, is inward looking. Its first priority and its first concern is territorial integrity. It is domestic in sort of security. And domestic security is tied to India's neighbors. And that predates the threats from China. And that will postdate any threats from China.
Mhm.
It is different that China has taken advantage of India's security challenges and, sort of exacerbated them, whether it is Chinese support for the Northeast insurgents, China's support for Pakistan, China's presence in Nepal, in Bhutan, in Maldives, Sri Lanka. Sort of, it is China taking advantage of it because, one, it is a low-cost policy for China. You want to keep India down. What is a better way to keep India tied to India's neighborhood than to increase India's challenges in its neighborhood?
Mhm.
Otherwise, if India had good relations with all its neighbors, then India's resources would be targeted towards the threat it faces from China on the continental and maritime domain. Right now, India's challenges are domestic and its neighborhood. So most of India's focus goes here rather than being sort of, being able to expend it vis-a-vis China and in the Indian Ocean region. So
Mhm.
India's, continental pull has a lot to do with, yes, with historical reasons, but it also has to do with the fact that it has to ensure that its neighborhood, its immediate neighbors.
Mhm.
And so China has increased that, the strategic encirclement and the challenge and the pressure on India. But whether or not China was a threat for India, and yes, it's been a threat since the 1950s, irrespective of that, from Indian state's point of view, it is internal security, internal cohesion.
Mhm.
And China is a part of that. The China-Pakistan nexus is part of that. China is part of that. Tibet is part of that. And so I would say that has it increased in the has the China factor increased in the last few decades? Yes, but that's also because the India-China dynamic has worsened. In 1989, 1990, there was barely any difference between India and China's GDP. In 2012, China's GDP was 5 times India's.
Mhm.
China has become stronger economically and militarily.
Mhm.
China has built its military and has built that infrastructure all along India's border. It has given economic sort of, basically thrown money and, sort of given sort of a lot of loans, high interest loans, military assistance, intelligence, in case of Pakistan, nuclear assistance to all of India's neighbors. And so it has worsened India's internal security and South Asian security challenges.
Mhm.
And so there, yes, but I'd say it's part of India's, we can't have sort of this way. India needs a stable neighborhood which keeps India's interests in mind, and China isn't allowing that. So is the neighborhood first policy an attempt to deal with the China problem? No, the neighborhood first policy is an attempt to ensure what India has wanted for 77 years, a peaceful, stable South Asia, which keeps India's interests in mind so that India does not have domestic internal security problems and India can grow economically and achieve its goals.
Mhm.
China forms a part of that today, but any country which tried to come into South Asia's, into the Indian neighborhood,
Mhm.
without keeping India's interest in mind would be a challenge to that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Would you mind delving a bit deeper into how you'd believe India could leverage its neighborhood, countries like Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, to then counter this Chinese growing and looming Chinese specter within the region? How can India loop these states into its, sort of against countering China's strategy?
So India has tried. I mean, sort of, it's India's policy towards South Asia, as I said earlier, it's a policy of sins of omission and commission. India has sort of, let's say, intervened. I won't necessarily say interfered, intervened in the domestic politics of these countries. There are parties, there are leaders, there are organizations which are quote unquote more sympathetic to India. I don't like to use pro and anti, more sympathetic to India, and those which are not. Um, it has, so, for example, in Nepal, the Nepali Congress is more sympathetic to India. The Nepali Communist Party has been more sympathetic to China. If you look at Bangladesh, it's the Awami League versus the BNP, Bangladesh National Party. Bhutan is a monarchy, so, sort of their political parties doesn't come in, it's the king. And by and large, the Bhutanese monarchy and the Indian state have had very good relations. You come to Sri Lanka, it's always been, sort of, the sort of the Sinhala majority parties have always, gone between better relations with India and, sort of better relations with China. India has supported actually, and tried to get benefits for the Tamils because of the fact that it has an impact. And I'll come to the details of that. Maldives, there's always been parties which have been more sympathetic to India and not. And so India has given economic assistance, India has given developmental assistance. India has supported, the countries at IMF or World Bank, so as to sort of demonstrate that, it's not that we want to tell you who you should bring into power. It's just that we want you to keep our interests in mind. Now, it is difficult. If you are a much smaller neighbor of India, then at some level, it's not just a question of the benefits that India gives. It's a question of identity. It's the strongest when it comes to Pakistan, but each one of sort of, and I would say it's not that much in Bangladesh, but sort of in Nepal, Nepalese nationalism, sort of there's a Nepalese ethnic identity, and part of there is that, are Gorkhas Nepalis only, or are the Madhesis, the people of Indian descent, also Nepalis? India has long championed that the Madhesis who've lived in Nepal for centuries should be given first-class citizenship status. But the Nepalese constitution is often differentiated. And so it's Nepalese identity and the civil disagreement over who is a Nepalese, where India factor comes in as well, right? And sort of Nepal is one of is the only country in South Asia whose citizens are allowed to work in India without visa. They can travel back and forth. They can work in the Indian government. The same, they can apply for any jobs just as any Indian citizen can. Indians cannot do that in Nepal. Nepalis can do that in India. India has given that. And yet there is that pushback, because when you have such a huge 1.4 billion people right next to you, you will always be worried that they will overwhelm your identity. Are you Nepalese? Are you Indian? So there is the Indian identity sort of threat or challenge which is there. When you come to Bangladesh, Bangladesh has a slightly, the Bengali identity is so strong that at some level the concern isn't about an Indian identity, because the Bengali identity in Bangladesh is very strong. It's more homogeneous, except for some parts of Bangladesh, Chakmas and others. The rest is all Bengali. And so it has an easier national identity. There, the issue with India has more to do with, the Northeast and the migration and all. It doesn't have to do with identity. Come to Sri Lanka again, Tamils have been living on the Sri Lankan island for centuries. Yes, some went centuries ago, some went during British colonial era, some may have gone later. Since for late sort of early 1950s, the Indian government has tried to resolve the Tamil issue. Till in the 50s, 60s, even the 70s under Indira Gandhi, India took back a number of Tamils, whom Sri Lanka said you have to take back. These are not Sri Lankan citizens. But there is, at some level, the Indian government says we can't take back everybody. They are Sri Lankan citizens. They are not Indian citizens.
Mhm.
But what happens to them impacts a state which is right on the border, where
Mhm.
there are a very large number of Tamils. So anything happening to the Tamils in Sri Lanka impacts Indian domestic politics.
Mhm.
Also, sort of just because there are Tamils in Sri Lanka doesn't mean that all Tamils are Indian.
Mhm.
And so there has been that back and forth. And so the Sinhala majority parties, we in varying degrees have felt that India, sort of that the India factor or that Indian sort of, and so therefore the China factor comes in because China isn't South Asia. It isn't involved in any of this. You can get economic assist. You can get China to invest and build a port, and you don't have to worry about domestic politics.
Mhm.
But there'll be other challenges. But so India's by default had to play in the domestic politics of all of its neighbors.
Mhm.
Sometimes it made mistakes. Sometimes things have gone well. But at some level, it is very difficult when India plays a role in the national identity in that country.
Mhm.
To what extent do you get involved that the other country does not push back at your identity? And there's nothing you can do about the fact that India is 1.4 billion people and that the Indian civilization, all of these countries were either part of an Indian empire or an Indian kingdom or speak an Indian language or share ethno-linguistic relations. Maldives again, sort of, island nation, very small population, a lot of economic developmental assistance, military assistance from India, protection by India, and yet there will be the fear that India will try and overwhelm. Indian companies will come and take over the market. Indian tourists will come and take over the market.
Mhm.
Sort of we need a balancer. So, and I've not even come to Pakistan, where the biggest issue is the Indian identity. That are we a South Asian Muslim country? In which case, Maldives is a South Asian Muslim country. Bangladesh is a South Asian Muslim country. So then we are not the only South Asian Muslim country. If we are not a South Asian Muslim country, the only South Asian Muslim country, who are we? If we are part of an Indian civilization, why did we break off in 1947? If there are almost as many Muslims in Pakistan as there are in India and
Mhm.
in Bangladesh, then why did partition take place?
Mhm.
The Indian identity will overwhelm the Pakistani identity. At least there was a Bengali identity and a Sinhali and a Ceylon and Maldives, sort of to some extent, they have even Nepali or Bhutanese. There
Mhm.
was no Pakistan before 1947. The word didn't exist before 1933.
Mhm.
Pakistani territory has always been a part of an Indian or an Afghan empire.
Mhm.
So, sort of, there are things India does and can do, but there'll always be a limitation when you are the largest country and the 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 civilization in that subcontinent.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's very important as a matter of fact that you mention how arbitrary these national lines can be, because at the end of the day, all India is, well, what is India other than accumulation of multiple ethnicities and
Absolutely.
ethno-linguistic groups, as you mentioned. I also want to pick up on something that I thought was pretty interesting in what you said about the fact that the political environments within India's neighboring countries, might not all be conducive to enhancing ties with India. And this just makes me think that in all other neighboring countries, other than India, China is perceived as a benign and positive
Mhm.
actor. And that is, for the first time, delivering on what other countries were not able to or were not willing to do so. So it seems to me as though there is a total dissonance in terms of how these countries perceive China and how India perceives China. So I'm then curious about your perspective on this and any recommendations you might have for India navigating this dissonance in terms of China's perception, and
Mhm.
also then deepening its engagement with its neighborhood within this complex environment.
So yes, it's true, it is. And so India's way of countering it has always been, I mean, let's say about 2.5, 3 decades ago, India's way into the 1970, because China's sort of, China-Pakistan relationship goes back to 1950s, but with the other countries a little later. So let's say when China started growing economically, the 70s, 80s, and the early 90s when China actually started giving economic assistance to the country, not assistance, economic, sort of investing in these countries, not through BRI. There was no BRI then. At that time, India's argument was, you know, you can't escape geography. We are where we are and you are where you are. So you can, get some investment from China. But at the end of the day, you'll have to come back to India.
Mhm.
As Chinese investment increased and China's penetration in India's neighborhood increased,
Mhm.
India has changed its policy to saying there's a difference between what China does and what we do. We don't
Mhm.
we don't give you high interest loans, which then you can't pay back, and we don't take your territory. So for India, the best, sort of counter to China was Hambantota,
Mhm.
to build this massive port when you already have Colombo, which whose berths are not fully used. This port is not used at all. And then Sri Lanka has to lease the port for 99 years and it cannot control which ships, submarines, ocean research vessels come there because it has leased it to China. It has no option.
Mhm.
And so, one, that India does not do high interest loans. So you're never going to be indebted to India forever for large amounts of money and have to pay back India over decades. That doesn't happen because India gives low interest loans or grants or lines of credit normally. That we loan you this money to do this work, to get this work done.
Mhm.
Second, India gives technical assistance, but India does not take Indian labor. So
Mhm.
whereas China brings in Chinese labor and there'll be an entire Chinese, sort of colony which will stay there for the purpose of any of these countries. India also uses local sort of supplies. It doesn't bring it over from China. So it's not Chinese companies benefiting, it will be local companies benefiting because the cement and everything will be locally sourced. So you're hiring local workers, you are, buying from local companies, and you are training the locals because India
Mhm.
has always had this India has strongly believed for decades that indigenization is important. India
Mhm.
believes in transfer of technology, indigenization, a country building its own economic and industrial potential. So India does
Mhm.
not want to do to its neighbors what others used to say, what happened to India in the colonial era. So India's argument has always been that there should be self-sufficiency at some level. So India helps train, but it's not going to, become the colonial power in any of those countries
Mhm.
or the debt. Sorry. Third, when there's a natural disaster, a humanitarian disaster, when there is an economic disaster, India is the first responder for all of these, whether it is COVID, it's an earthquake, it's a tsunami, or it is a debt crisis.
Mhm.
India always comes in, China never comes in. And India makes it a point. And it's actually very clear when you see that China just refused, for example, the first few weeks when Sri Lanka's crisis happened in April. Again, Sri Lanka has been the best example. China didn't say anything. And China faced pushback, and then they finally, China doesn't even renegotiate its loans. Despite Sri Lanka's problems, it was unwilling to renegotiate the loans and the debt. And so, in some ways, what China does is the best. All India has to do is highlight that. And India has been doing it. But India does the exact opposite of what China does when it gives aid, assistance, support.
Mhm.
Finally, India does believe that every country is an independent actor. They do need to take in decisions in their own interests. If they make a mistake, India will be there to help them. But they maybe need to make the mistake in order to realize who their true friend and partner is and who isn't. India is not going to make their decisions for them.
Mhm. That's a very interesting point. I think we have time for just one last question, so I'll have a quick follow-up on that. You mentioned China coming in with its, development and infrastructural projects and having different criteria for its projects as opposed to India. And, to some degree, it's even argued that these criteria are a lot more lenient compared to what India would have upheld and India would have enforced. So what I'm now curious about is how did a preference for China turn into an aversion for India and the neighborhood? And I think the best example is, as you were mentioning, the India Out campaign in Maldives. Because, in fact, in the Maldivian case, it appears that neighboring states tilt towards China is driven by the desire to balance a larger neighbor, India.
Mhm.
And so, if you could dwell a bit more on the roots of this India Out campaign and where you think this trend of India aversion within the neighborhood might lead to in the future.
So I'd say, sort of part of it is rhetoric.
Mm,
It is sort of political parties in India's neighbors who come in, saying that, India is the problem, India is the hegemon, we want India out. There will be certain things which are said and done, and in the end, it calms down. I mean,
mm,
for the India out, the government made statements in Malé, and then afterwards there have been negotiations between India and Maldives. There have been conversations. So some of it will, I do think a lot of it will be rhetoric. Maldives cannot escape India geographically. There is no way it can escape India. It's just that, at some level, it plays well in domestic politics in each of these countries. It does. Just as anti-American rhetoric does well in many countries, doesn't necessarily mean uh, most of the parties or political parties in countries talking about anti-Americanism, when they come into power, they want good relations with the US. They want the economic investment. They want the military assistance. But it plays well to get people riled up and to blame somebody.
mhm,
It was we can give examples in Pakistan in 2018 when then Prime Minister, when Imran Khan won elections, he criticized his previous predecessor Nawaz Sharif for, and his slogan was Modi ka yaar gaddar. Anybody who's friends with Modi is a traitor. But within the first few months, he sent a letter to Prime Minister Modi asking to improve relations. Didn't really follow through on that, but his rhetoric was anti-American, but he wanted American investment. So, Maldives we may have said that even the BNP, if it had come to power in Bangladesh, after the initial, accusing spread, the other party of anti-India, or it would have also, because where will the investment come from? Every country's biggest neighbor, the biggest trading partner has to be its neighbor. It can't be a country, which is very far away. It's just not, that's not how trade functions. And so, you know, the India out rhetoric, the anti-India rhetoric is sort of at some level rhetoric. Yes, you know, will it have an impact in the immediate 6 months to 1 year? It will. Is it possible that certain Indian companies may not invest in Maldives for 6 months to 1 year? Yes. Has then been, I'm sure you followed the tourism, where
mhm,
Indian tourists were not going to Maldives. Indian tourists are among the biggest tourists in the region, whether
mhm,
it's to Maldives, it's to Sri Lanka, or it's to Southeast Asia, or even to Europe. They are a large number. And so, rhetoric cannot sustain an economy. Rhetoric may get you some brownie points and some, good some public opinion surveys, but in 6 months to 1 year, when there are economic challenges,
mhm,
you cannot sustain and keep people happy on rhetoric. So, you will need to improve relations with India, even if it will be initially backdoor. Even if you say in public, oh, we're going to ask all the Indian military to leave, they may not actually leave. And you may play up the numbers. They are not that many, but you will pretend that there are a lot more and up. And so there will be a wire media which happens. It happened in Nepal, it happened in Sri Lanka, it will happen in Maldives.
mhm. Well, I think you've put it very well in the fact that geography is inescapable and that all of these countries are bound to India's neighborhood, and your biggest trading partner, your biggest partner for many reasons does end up being your neighbor.
Yeah.
And then definitely the second most interesting point for me was you mentioning that India's neighborhood policy is not a product of, countering China, but a product of Indian thought and Indian strategy from its inception from Prime Minister Nehru's time. And so what we're seeing today is a continuation in this. Well,
Absolutely.
thank you so much for your time, Dr. Pandey. This has been a very insightful conversation, and thank you to everyone who joined us. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.